Hi there, and welcome to StoryStream, the VPL's Storytime for Adults. My name is Jonna, and today I'm coming to you from the atrium of the Central Library, which is located at 350 West Georgia. Now, this location, just like all 21 of our branches, is located on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. To find out more about the people who have lived in this land since time immemorial, or to learn more about truth and reconciliation and what VPL is doing, please visit our website. Now, we all know that the library is a great place to come to get books, magazines, and more. But did you know that we also have materials and services for patrons who are living with limited mobility or print disabilities? That's right, folks. Today, we're talking about accessibility, and we'll be highlighting a unique department here at the Central Library that serves patrons in their search for accessible formats and services. The Vancouver Public Library first began what is now known as accessible services in 1977, after the public expressed their interest in developing a shut-in service for those who were unable to make it into a physical location for materials. The collection was mainly composed of what we used to call talking books and was housed in the basement of the Kitsilano Branch Library. The service proved to be popular, seeing a growth of over 55% in its first year, and continued to grow, prompting the collection and the staff to move to their own location, now dubbed Outreach Services, at the newly built Central Library in 1995. Over the past 20-plus years, the services continued to grow, with ebooks and e-audiobooks allowing users to access the collection easily. But the demand for physical materials has persisted, prompting another move to Level 3 of the Central Library. To get to accessible services, enter the main library doors and go up the elevator or the escalator one floor. Our collections and staff are in the southeast corner of the building. There you'll find an adjustable service desk, a magnifier, an accessible computer station, and an Optelec machine. We also have a mobility device accessible washroom with a grab bar and button-enabled automatic door, should nature call. But please note that our hours here are a little bit different than the rest of the library, so be sure to check the website or give us a call before you come down. A print disability is one that prevents a person from reading conventional text. It can be the result of a learning disability, a physical disability, or a visual disability. Luckily, our library materials can come in all sorts of accessible formats, such as DAISY disc readers and MP3s. Now, this department, which is located on Level 3, works with facilities like long-term care homes to provide a book deposit service, which helps to keep residents well in stock of fresh materials to explore on a 4-week rotation. As well, if you or somebody that you know and love is unable to make it to the Central Library, we can send them audiobooks through Canada Post or through branch pickup. If you aren't able to come to the library for 3 months or longer, we can even offer home delivery from our fantastic staff in our electric accessible services delivery van. Our Accessible Services Department teams up with organizations like the Center for Equitable Library Access, also known as CELA, and the National Network for Equitable Library Service, NNELS, to make library collections accessible to readers with print disabilities. These partnerships and this service make the wide, wonderful world of library service equitable to all, and it provides access to even more collections and formats such as Braille. To learn more about VPL's Accessible Services Department, check out our website or give us a call. We're lucky enough today to be joined by 2 guests, Marilyn Rushton and Betty Noble. Betty and Marilyn are both members of the blind community and use Braille materials as well as audiobooks. Today, they will both be reading short stories by Canada's Lucy Maud Montgomery to celebrate International Women's Day. Lucy Maud Montgomery was born in 1874 in a small village on the eastern coast of Canada in what is now called Prince Edward Island. She loved where she lived and focused on much of her writing on the landscape and the people of that place. Prolific barely begins to describe Lucy's body of work. She published over 20 novels, over 500 short stories, an autobiography, and a book of poetry. Her fame was not limited to Canadian audiences. The work that she is most known for, Anne of Green Gables, is a success worldwide. Montgomery was at one point the most successful Canadian author of all time, but because her books were described as children's books and women's books, she was often dismissed by the male critics that dominated the industry at the time. Regardless, it is not an overstatement to say that Lucy was a champion for women, inspiring generations to live life without regret and to seek out joy unapologetically like her characters. She died in 1942 at the age of 67, but she will live on in the hearts and minds of young and old for generations to come. Betty Noble has taught adults who were blind or partially sighted for 33 years at the Vancouver Community College, and then worked part-time in Burnaby, Richmond, and North Vancouver school districts, teaching children with visual impairments until her retirement in June of 2019. She loves to read or listen to books, and she can remember spending many hours browsing the shelves of her school library. She's a member of the Good Noise Vancouver Gospel Choir because she loves to sing. She and her husband, Don, have been married for 48 years and have 2 children and 6 grandchildren. Please enjoy Betty reading Lucy Maud Montgomery's short story, Elizabeth's Child.
This story is called Elizabeth's Child, and the author of this short story is Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Ingelows of Ingelo Grange were not a marrying family. Only one of them, Elizabeth, had married, and perhaps it was her poor match that discouraged the others. At any rate, Ellen and Charlotte and George Ingelo at the Grange were single, and so was Paul down at Greenwood Farm. It was 17 years since Elizabeth had married James Sheldon, in the face of the most decided opposition on the part of her family. Sheldon was a handsome, shiftless ne'er-do-well without any violent bad habits, but also without any backbone, as the Ingelos declared. There is sometimes hope for a man who is actively bad, Charlotte Ingelo had said sententiously, but whoever heard of reforming a jellyfish? Elizabeth and her husband had gone west and settled on a prairie farm in Manitoba. She had never been home since. Perhaps her pride kept her away, for she had the Ingelo share of that, and she soon discovered that her family's estimate of James Sheldon had been the true one. There was no active resentment on either side, and once in a long while, letters were exchanged. Still, ever since her marriage, Elizabeth had been practically an outsider and an alien. As the years came and went, the Ingelos at home remembered only at long intervals that they had a sister on the western prairies. One of these remembrances came to Charlotte Ingelo on a spring afternoon when the great orchards about the Grange were pink and white with apple and cherry blossoms, and over every hill and field was a delicate, flower-starred green. A soft breeze was blowing loose petals from the August, sweeting through the open door of the wide hall when Charlotte came through it. Ellen and George were standing on the steps outside. "This kind of a day always makes me think of Elizabeth," said Charlotte dreamily. "It was in apple blossom time she went away." The Ingelos always spoke of Elizabeth's going away, never of her marrying. 17 years ago, said Ellen. Why, Elizabeth's oldest child must be quite a young woman now. A sudden idea swept over and left her a little breathless. I would really like to see her. Then, why don't you write and ask her to come? She could come east and visit us, asked George, who did not often speak, but who always spoke to some purpose when he did. Ellen and Charlotte looked at each other. I would like to see Elizabeth's child, repeated Ellen firmly. Do you think she would come? Asked Charlotte. You know, when James Sheldon died 5 years ago, we wrote to Elizabeth and asked her to come home and live with us. And she seemed almost resentful in the letter she wrote back. I've never said so before, but I've often thought it. Yes, she did, said Ellen, who had often thought so too, but never said so. Elizabeth was always very independent, remarked George. Perhaps she thought your little letter savored of charity or pity. No Angelo would endure that. At any rate, you know, she refused to come, even for a visit. She said she could not leave the farm. She may refuse to let her child come. It won't do any harm to ask her, said George. In the end, Charlotte wrote to Elizabeth and asked her to let her daughter visit the old homestead. The letter was written and mailed in much perplexity and distrust. When once the glow of momentary enthusiasm in the new idea had passed. What if Elizabeth's child is like her father? Queried Charlotte in a half whisper. Let us hope she won't be, cried Ellen fervently. Indeed, she felt that a feminine edition of James Sheldon would be more than she could endure. She may not like us or our ways, sighed Charlotte. We don't know how she's being brought up. She will seem like a stranger, after all. I really long to see Elizabeth's child, but I can't help fearing we have done a rash thing, Ellen. Perhaps she may not come, suggested Ellen, wondering whether she hoped it or feared it. But Worth Sheldon did come. Elizabeth wrote back a prompt acceptance with no trace of the proud bitterness that had permeated her answer to the former invitation. The Ingelows at the Grange were thrown into a flutter when the letter came. In another week, Elizabeth's child would be with them. If only she isn't like her father, said Charlotte with foreboding as she aired and swept the southeast spare room for their expected guest. They had 3 spare rooms at the Grange, but the aunts had selected the southeast one for their niece because it was done in white, and white seems the most appropriate for a young girl, Elizabeth said as she arranged a pitcher of wild roses on the table. I think everything is ready, announced Charlotte. I put the very finest sheets on the bed. They smell deliciously of lavender, and we had very good luck doing up the muslin curtains. It is pleasant to be expecting a guest, isn't it, Ellen? I have often thought, although I have never said so before, that our lives were too self-centered. We seem to have no interests outside of ourselves. Even Elizabeth has been really nothing to us, you know. She seemed to have become a stranger. I hope her child will be the means of bringing us nearer together again. If she has James Sheldon's round face and big blue eyes and curly yellow hair, I shall never really like her, no matter how Angelo-ish she may be inside, said Ellen decidedly. When Worth Sheldon came, each of her aunts drew a long breath of relief. Worth was not in the least like her father in appearance. Neither did she resemble her mother, who had been a sprightly, black-haired and black-eyed girl. Worth was tall and straight, with a long braid of thick, wavy brown hair, large, level-gazing gray eyes, a square jaw, and an excellent chin with a dimple in it. She is the very image of Mother's sister, Aunt Alice, who died so long ago, said Charlotte. You don't remember her, Ellen, but I do very well. She was the sweetest woman that ever drew breath. She was Paul's favorite aunt, too, Charlotte added with a sigh. Paul's antagonistic attitude was the only drawback to the joy of this meeting. How delightful it would have been if he had not refused to be there, too, to welcome Elizabeth's child. Worth came to hearts prepared to love her, but they must have loved her in any case. In a day, Aunt Charlotte and Aunt Ellen and shy, quiet Uncle George had yielded wholly to her charm. She was girlishly bright and merry, frankly delighted with the old homestead and the quaint, old-fashioned, daintily kept rooms. Yet there was no suggestion of gush about her. She did not go into raptures, but her pleasure shone out in her eyes and tones. There was so much to tell and ask and remember the first day that it was not until the second morning after her arrival that Worth asked the question her aunts had been dreading. She asked it out in the orchard, in the emerald gloom of a long arcade of stout old trees that Grandfather Angelo had planted 50 years ago. Aunt Charlotte, when is Uncle Paul coming up to see us? I long to see him. Mother has talked so much to me about him. She was his favorite sister, wasn't she? Charlotte and Ellen looked at each other. Ellen nodded slowly. It would be better to tell Worth the whole truth at once. She would certainly find it out soon. I do not think, my dear, said Aunt Charlotte quietly, that your Uncle Paul will be up to see you at all. Why not? Asked Worth, her serious gray eyes looking straight into Aunt Charlotte's troubled, dark ones. Aunt Charlotte understood that Elizabeth had never told Worth anything about her family's resentment of her marriage. It was not a pleasant thing to have to explain it all to Elizabeth's child, but it must be done. I think, my dear, she said gently, that I will have to tell you a little bit of our family history that may not be very pleasant to hear or tell. Perhaps you don't know that when your mother married, we did not exactly approve of her marriage. Perhaps we were mistaken. At any rate, it was wrong and foolish to let it come between us and her as we have done. But that is how it was. None of us approved, as I have said, but none of us was so bitter as your Uncle Paul. Your mother was his favorite sister, and he was very deeply attached to her. She was only a year younger than he. When he bought the Greenwood farm, she went and kept house for him for 3 years before her marriage. When she married, Paul was terribly angry. He was always a strange man, very determined and unyielding. He said he would never forgive her, and he never has. He has never married, and he has lived so long alone at Greenwood with only deaf Mrs. Bree to keep house for him that he has grown older than ever. One of us wanted to go and keep house for him, but he wouldn't let us. And I must tell you this, although I hate to. He was very angry when he heard we had invited you to visit us, and he said he would not come near the Grange as long as you were here. Oh, you can't realize how bitter and obstinate he is. We pleaded with him, but I think That only made him worse. We have felt so bad over it, your Aunt Ellen and your Uncle George and I, but we can do nothing at all. Worth had listened gravely. The story was all new to her, but she had long thought that there must be something at the root of her mother's indifferent relations with her old home and friends. When Aunt Charlotte, flushed and half tearful, finished speaking, a little glimmer of fun came into Worth's gray eyes, and her dimple was very pronounced as she said, "Then, if Uncle Paul will not come to see me, I must go to see him." "My dear," cried both her aunts together in dismay. Aunt Ellen got her breath first. "Oh, my dear child, you must not think of such a thing," she cried nervously. "He would never do. He would, I don't know what he would do. Order you off the premises or say something dreadful." No, wait. Perhaps he will come after all. We will see. You must have patience." Worth shook her head, and the smile in her eyes deepened. "I don't think he will come," she said. "Mother has told me something about the Angelo stubbornness. She says I have it in full measure, but I like to call it determination. It sounds so much better. No, the mountain will not come to Mohammed, so Mohammed will go to the mountain. I think I will walk down to Greenwood this afternoon. There, dear aunties, don't look so troubled. Uncle Paul won't run at me with a pitchfork, will he? I can't. Well, he can't do worse than order me off his premises, as you say." Aunt Charlotte shook her head. She understood that no argument would turn the girl from her purpose if she had the Angelo will, so she said nothing more. In the afternoon, Worth set out for Greenwood, a mile away. "Oh, what will Paul say?" exclaimed the aunts with dismal foreboding. Worth met her Uncle Paul at the garden gate. He was standing there when she came up the slope of the long lane, a tall, massive figure of a man with deep-set black eyes, a long, prematurely white beard, and a hooked nose. Handsome and stubborn enough, Paul Angelo looked. It was not without reason that his neighbors called him the oddest Angelo of them all. Behind him was a fine old farmhouse in beautiful grounds. Worth felt almost as much interested in Greenwood as in the Grange. It had been her mother's home for 3 years, and Elizabeth Angelo had loved it and talked much to her daughter of it. Paul Angelo did not move or speak, although he probably guessed who his visitor was. Worth held out her hand. "How do you do, Uncle Paul?" she said. Paul ignored the outstretched hand. "Who are you?" he asked gruffly. "I am Worth Sheldon, your sister Elizabeth's daughter," she answered. "Won't you shake hands with me, Uncle Paul?" "I have no sister Elizabeth," he answered unbendingly. Worth folded her hands on the gatepost and met his frowning gaze unshrinkingly. "Oh, yes, you have," she said calmly. "You can't do away with natural ties by simply ignoring them, Uncle Paul. They go on existing. I never knew until this morning that you were at enmity with my mother. She never told me, but she has talked a great deal of you to me. She has told me often how much you and she loved each other and how good you always were to her. She sent her love to you." "Years ago, I had a sister Elizabeth," said Paul Angelo harshly. "I loved her very tenderly, but she married against my will a shiftless scamp who..." Worth lifted her hand slightly. He was my father, Uncle Paul, and he was always kind to me. Whatever his faults may have been, I cannot listen to a word against him. You shouldn't have come here then, he said. But he did say it less harshly. There was even a certain reluctant approval of this composed, independent niece in his eyes. Didn't they tell you at the Grange that I didn't want to see you? Yes, they told me this morning. But I wanted to see you, so I came. Why cannot we be friends, Uncle Paul? Not because we are uncle and niece, but simply because you are you and I am I. Let us leave my father and mother out of the question and start fair on our account. For a moment, Uncle Paul looked at her. She met his gaze frankly and firmly, with a merry smile lurking in her eyes. Then he threw back his head and laughed a hearty laugh that was good to hear. Very well, he said, it is a bargain. He put his hand over the gate and shook hers. Then he opened the gate and invited her into the house. Worth stayed to tea, and Uncle Paul showed her all over Greenwood. You are to come here as often as you like, he told her. When a young lady and I make a compact of friendship, I am going to live up to it. But you are not to talk to me about your mother. Remember, we are friends because I am I and you are you, and there is no question of anybody else. The Grange Angelos were amazed to see Paul bringing Worth home in his buggy that evening. When Worth had gone into the house, Charlotte told him that she was glad to see that he had relented towards Elizabeth's child. I have not, he made stern answer. I don't know whom you mean by Elizabeth's child. That young woman and I have taken a liking for each other, which we mean to cultivate on our own account. Don't call her Elizabeth's child to me again. As the days and weeks went by, Worth grew dearer and dearer to the Grange folk. The aunts often wondered to themselves how they had existed before Worth came, and oftener yet, how they could do without her when the time came for her to go home. Meanwhile, the odd friendship between her and Uncle Paul deepened and grew. They read and drove and walked together. Worth spent half her time at Greenwood. Once Uncle Paul said to her, as if speaking half to himself, "To think that James Sheldon could have a daughter like you." Up went Worth's head. Worth's gray eyes flashed. "I thought we were not to speak of my parents," she said. "You ought not to have been the first to break the compact, Uncle Paul." "I accept the rebuke and beg your pardon," he said. He liked her all the better for those little flashes of spirit across her girlish composure. One day in September, they were together in the garden at Greenwood. Worth, looking lovingly and regretfully down the sun-flecked avenue of box, said with a sigh, "Next month I must go home. How sorry I shall be to leave the Grange and Greenwood. I have had such a delightful summer, and I have learned to love all the old nooks and corners as well as if I had lived here all my life." "Stay here," said Uncle Paul abruptly. "Stay here with me." "I want you, Worth. Let Greenwood be your home henceforth, and adopt your crusty old bachelor uncle for a father." "Oh, Uncle Paul," cried Worth, "I don't know. I don't think. Oh, you surprise me." I surprise myself, perhaps, but I mean it, Worth. I am a rich, lonely old man, and I want to keep this new interest you have brought into my life. Stay with me. I will try to give you a very happy life, my child, and all I have shall be yours. Seeing her troubled face, he added, There, I don't ask you to decide right here. I suppose you have other claims to adjust. Take time to think it over. Thank you, said Worth. She went back to the Grange as one in a dream and shut herself up in the white southeast room to think. She knew that she wanted to accept this unexpected offer of Uncle Paul's. Worth's loyal tongue had never betrayed, even to the loving aunts, any discontent in the prairie farm life that had always been hers. But it had been a hard life for the girl, narrow and poverty-bounded. She longed to put forth her hand and take this other life, which opened so temptingly before her. She knew, too, that her mother, ambitious for her child, would not be likely to interpose any objections. She had only to go to Uncle Paul, and all that she longed for would be given her, together with the faithful, protecting, fatherly love and care that in all its strength and sweetness had never been hers. She must decide for herself. Not even of Aunt Charlotte or Aunt Ellen could she ask advice. She knew they would entreat her to accept, and she needed no such incentive to her own wishes. Far on into the night, Worth sat at the white-curtained dormer window, looking at the stars over the apple trees and fighting her battle between inclination and duty. It was a hard and stubbornly contested battle, but with that square chin and those unfaltering gray eyes, it could end in only one way. Next day, Worth went down to Greenwood. Well, what is it to be? Said Uncle Paul without preface as he met her in the garden. I cannot come, Uncle Paul, said Worth steadily. I cannot give up my mother. I don't ask you to give her up, he said gruffly. You can write to her and visit her. I don't want to come between parent and child. That isn't the point exactly, Uncle Paul. I hope you will not be angry with me for not accepting your offer. I wanted to. You don't know how much I wanted to, but I cannot. Mother and I are so much to each other, Uncle Paul. More, I am sure, than even most mothers and daughters. You have never let me speak of her, but I must tell you this. Mother has often told me that when I came to her, things were going very hard with her, and that I was heaven's own gift to comfort and encourage her. Then in the 10 years that followed, the 3 other babies that came to her all died before they were 2 years old. And with each loss, Mother said I grew dearer to her. Don't you see, Uncle Paul? I'm not merely just one child to her, but I'm all those children. 6 years ago, the twins were born, and they are dear, bright little lads, but they are very small yet, so Mother has really nobody but me. I know she would consent to let me stay here because she would think it best for me, but it wouldn't be really best for me. It couldn't be best for a girl to do what wasn't right. I love you, Uncle Paul, and I love Greenwood, and I want to stay so much, but I cannot. I have thought it all over, and I must go back to Mother. Uncle Paul did not say one word. He turned his back on Worth and walked the full length of the box alley twice. Worth watched him wistfully. Was he very angry? Would he forgive her? "You are an Angelo, Worth," he said when he came back. That was all, but Worth understood that her decision was not to cause any estrangement between them. A month later, Worth's last day at the Grange came. She was to leave for the West the next morning. They were all out in Grandfather Angelo's arcade. Uncle George and Aunt Charlotte and Aunt Ellen and Worth, enjoying the ripe, mellow sunshine of the October day when Paul Angelo came up the slope. Worth went to meet him with outstretched hands. He took them both in his and looked at her very gravely. "I have not come to say goodbye, Worth. I will not say it. You are coming back to me." Worth shook her brown head sadly. "Oh, I cannot, Uncle Paul. You know, I told you." "Yes, I know," he interrupted. I've been thinking it all over every day since. You know yourself what the Angelo determination is. It's a good thing in a good cause, but a bad thing in a bad one. And it is no easy thing to conquer when you've let it rule you for years, as I have done. But I have conquered it, or you have conquered it for me. Child, here is a letter. It is to your mother, my sister, Elizabeth. In it, I have asked her to forgive me and to forget our long estrangement. I have asked her to come back to me with you and her boys. I want you all at Greenwood, and I will do the best I can for you all." "Oh, Uncle Paul," cried Worth, her face aglow and quivering with smiles and tears and sunshine. "Do you think she will forgive me and come?" "I know she will," cried Worth. "I know how she has longed for you and home. Oh, I am so happy, Uncle Paul." He smiled at her and put his arm over her shoulder. Together they walked up the golden arcade to tell the others. That night, Charlotte and Ellen cried with happiness as they talked it over in the twilight. "How beautiful," murmured Charlotte softly. "We shall not lose Worth after all." "Ellen, I could not have borne it to see that girl utterly out of our lives again. I always hoped and believed that Elizabeth's child would somehow bring us all together again," said Ellen happily. The end.
Marilyn Rushton is a retired teacher of students with visual disabilities. She and her husband, Ken, are members of the Vancouver City Soul Choir, and she's in a women's vocal trio called The Old Broad's Way. Marilyn loves to read novels and has been a Braille user since grade 1. In addition, she enjoys hiking with Ken and her guide dog, dragon boating, and learning to use different kinds of fitness equipment. She has 2 sons and 3 grandchildren. Please enjoy Marilyn reading Lucy Maud Montgomery's short story, At the Bayshore Farm.
This story is entitled At the Bayshore Farm. The author is Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Newberrys were agog with excitement over the governor's picnic. As they talked it over on the veranda at sunset, they felt that life could not be worth living to those unfortunate people who had not been invited to it. Not that there were many of the latter in Claymont, for it was the governor's native village, and the Claymonters were getting up the picnic for him during his political visit to the city 15 miles away. Each of the Newberrys had a special reason for wishing to attend the governor's picnic. Ralph and Elliot wanted to see the governor himself. He was a pet hero of theirs. Had he not once been a Claymont lad just like themselves? Had he not risen to the highest office in the state by dint of sheer hard work and persistency? Had he not won a national reputation by his prompt and decisive measures during the big strike at Campeen? And was he not a man personally and politically whom any boy might be proud to imitate? Yes, to all of these questions. Hence, to the Newberry boys, the interest of the picnic centered in the governor. "I shall feel 2 inches taller just to get a look at him," said Ralph enthusiastically. "He isn't much to look at," said Frances rather patronizingly. "I saw him once at Campton. He came to the school when his daughter was graduated. He is bald and fat." "Oh, of course he is famous and all that. But I want to go to the picnic to see Sarah Beaumont. She's to be there with the Chandlers from Campton, and Mary Spearman, who knows her by sight, is going to point her out to me. I suppose it would be too much to expect to be introduced to her. Oh, I will probably have to content myself with just looking at her." Ralph resented hearing the governor called bald and fat. Somehow it seemed like his hero was being reduced to the level of common clay. "That's like a girl," he said loftily, "thinking more about a woman who writes books than about a man like the governor." "I'd rather see Sarah Beaumont than 40 governors," retorted Frances. "Why, she's famous, and her books are perfect. If I could ever hope to write anything like them, it's been the dream of my life just to see her ever since I read The Story of Idlewild, and now to think that it is going to be fulfilled. It seems too good to be true that tomorrow, Newberry's, I shall see Sarah Beaumont." "Well," said Cecilia gently. Cecilia was always gentle, even in her enthusiasm. "I shall like to see the governor and Sarah Beaumont too, but I'm going to the picnic more for the sake of seeing Nan Harris than anything else. It's 3 years since she went away, you know, and I've never had another chum whom I loved so dearly. I'm just looking forward to meeting her and talking over all our dear good old times. I do wonder if she has changed much, but I am sure I shall know her." "By her red hair and freckles?" questioned Elliot teasingly. "They'll be just the same as ever, I'll be bound." Cecilia flushed and looked as angry as she could, which isn't saying much after all. She didn't mind when Elliot teased her about her pug nose and her big mouth, but it always hurt her when he made fun of Nan. Nan's family had once lived across the street from the Newberrys. Nan and Cecilia had been playmates all through childhood, but when both girls were 14, the Harrises had moved out west. Cecilia had never seen Nan since, but now the latter had come east for a visit and was with her relatives in Campton. She was to be at the picnic, and Cecilia's cup of delight brimmed over. Mrs. Newberry came briskly into the middle of their sunset plans. She had been down to the post office, and she carried an open letter in her hand. "Mother," said Frances, straightening up anxiously, You have a pitying expression on your face. Which of us is it for? Speak out. Don't leave us in suspense. Has Mary Spearman told you that Sarah Beaumont isn't going to be at the picnic? Or that the governor isn't going to be there? Or that Nan Harris isn't coming? Or that something's happened to put off the whole affair altogether? Cried Ralph and Cecilia and Elliot all at once. Mrs. Newberry laughed. No, it's none of those things. And I don't know just whom I do pity, but it is one of you girls. This is a letter from Grandmother Newberry. Tomorrow is her birthday, and she wants either Frances or Cecilia to go out to Ashland on the early morning train and spend the day at the Bayshore farm. There was silence on the veranda of the Newberrys for the space of 10 seconds. Then Frances burst out with, Mother, you know neither of us can go tomorrow if it were any other day but the day of the picnic. I'm sorry, but one of you must go, said Mrs. Newberry firmly. Your father said so when I called at the store to show him this letter. Grandmother Newberry would be very much hurt and displeased if her invitation were disregarded. You know that. But we leave it to yourselves to decide which one shall go. Don't do that, implored Frances miserably. Pick one of us yourselves. Pull straws, anything to shorten the agony. No, you must settle it for yourselves, said Mrs. Newberry. But in spite of herself, she looked at Cecilia. Cecilia was apt to be looked at some way when things were to be given up. Mostly, it was Cecilia who gave them up. The family had come to expect it of her. They all said that Cecilia was very unselfish. Cecilia knew that her mother looked at her, but she did not turn her face. She couldn't just then. She looked away out over the hills and tried hard to swallow something that had come up in her throat. Glad I'm not a girl, said Ralph, when Mrs. Newberry had gone into the house. Phew, nothing could induce me to give up that picnic. Not if a dozen Grandmother Newberrys were offended. Where's your sparkle gone now, Fran? It's too bad of Grandmother Newberry, declared Frances angrily. Oh, Fran, she didn't know about the picnic, said Cecilia, but still, without turning around. Well, she needn't always be so annoyed if we don't go when we're invited. Another day would have done just as well, said Frances shortly. Something in her voice sounded choked, too. She rose and walked to the other end of the veranda, where she stood and scowled down the road. Ralph and Elliot, feeling uncomfortable, went away. The veranda was very still for a long while. The sun had quite set, and it was growing dark when Frances came back to the step. Well, what are you going to do about it? She said shortly. Which of us is to go to the Bayshore? I suppose I had better go, said Cecilia slowly, very slowly. Frances kicked her slippered toe against the firm jardiniere. You might see Nan Harris somewhere else before she goes back, she said consolingly. Yes, I may, said Cecilia. She knew quite well that she would not. Nan would return to Campton on the special train, and she was going back west in 3 days. It was hard to give the picnic up, but Cecilia was used to giving things up. Nobody ever expected Frances to give things up. She was so brilliant and popular that the good things of life came her way naturally. It never seemed to matter so much about poor, quiet Celia. Cecilia cried herself to sleep that night. She felt that it was horribly selfish of her to do so, but she just couldn't help it. She awoke in the morning with a confused idea that it was very late. Why hadn't Mary called her, as she'd been told to do? Through the open door between her room and Frances's, she could see the latter's bed was empty. Then she saw a little note addressed to her, pinned on the pillow. "Dear Saint Cecilia," it ran, "when you read this, I shall be on the train to Ashland to spend the day with Grandmother Newbury. You've been giving up things so often and so long that I suppose you think you have a monopoly of it, but you see, you haven't. I didn't tell you this last night because I hadn't quite made up my mind, but after you went upstairs, I fought it out to a finish and made the decision. Sarah Beaumont will keep, but Nan Harris wouldn't, so you must go to the picnic. I told Mary to call me instead of you this morning, and I am now off. You needn't spoil your fun pitying me. Now that the wrench is over, I feel a most delightful glow of virtuous satisfaction. Fran." If by running after Frances Cecilia could have brought her back, Cecilia would have run. But a glance at her watch told her that Frances must already be halfway to Ashland, so she could only accept the situation. Well, anyway, she thought, I'll get Mary to point Sarah Beaumont out to me, and I'll store up a description of her in my mind to tell Frances tonight. I must remember to take notice of the color of her eyes. Fran has always been exercised about that. It was mid-forenoon when Frances arrived at Ashland Station. Grandmother Newbury's man, Hiram, was waiting for her with the pony carriage, and Frances heartily enjoyed the 3-mile drive to the Bayshore farm. Grandmother Newbury came to the door to meet her granddaughter. She was a tall, handsome old lady with piercing black eyes and thick white gray hair. There was no savor of the traditional grandmother with cap and knitting about her. She was like a stately old princess. Much as her grandchildren admired her, they were decidedly in awe of her. "So it is Frances," she said, bending her head graciously that Frances might kiss her still rosy cheek. "I expected it would be Cecilia. I heard after I had written you that there was to be a gubernatorial picnic in Claymont today, so I was quite sure it would be Cecilia. Why isn't it Cecilia?" Frances flushed a little. There was a meaning tone in Grandmother Newbury's voice. Cecilia was very anxious to go to the picnic to see an old friend of hers, she answered. She was willing to come here, but you know, Grandmother, that Cecilia is always willing to do the things somebody else ought to do. So I decided I would stand on my rights as Miss Newbury for once and come to the Bayshore. Grandmother Newbury smiled. She understood. Frances had always been her favorite granddaughter, but she had never been blind, clear-sighted old lady that she was, to the little leaven of easygoing selfishness in the girl's nature. She was pleased to see that Frances had conquered it this time. "I'm glad it is you who has come, principally because you are cleverer than Cecilia," she said brusquely. "Or at least you are the better talker. And I wanted a clever girl and a good talker to help me entertain a guest today. She is clever herself, and she likes young girls. She is a particular friend of your Uncle Robert's family down south, and that is why I have asked her to spend a few days with me. You will like her." Here Grandmother Newbury led Frances into the sitting room. "Mrs. Kennedy, this is my granddaughter Frances Newbury. I told you about her last night and her ambitions. You see, Frances, we have talked you over." Mrs. Kennedy was a much younger woman than Grandmother Newbury. She was certainly no older than 50, and in spite of her gray hair, looked almost girlish. So bright were her dark eyes, so clear-cut and fresh her delicate face, and so smart her general appearance. Frances, although not given to sudden likings, took one for Mrs. Kennedy. She thought she had never seen so charming a face. She found herself enjoying the day immensely. In fact, she forgot about the governor's picnic and Sarah Beaumont altogether. Mrs. Kennedy proved to be a delightful companion. She had traveled extensively and was an excellent raconteur. She had seen much of men and women and crystallized her experiences into sparkling little sentences and epigrams, which made Frances feel as if she were listening to one of the witty people in clever books. But under all that sparkling wit, there was a strongly felt undercurrent of true womanly sympathy and kind-heartedness, which won affection as speedily as her brilliance won admiration. Frances listened and laughed and enjoyed. Once she found time to think that she would have missed a great deal if she had not come to Bayshore Farm that day. Surely talking to a woman like Mrs. Kennedy was better than looking at Sarah Beaumont from a distance. "I've been rewarded in the most approved storybook style," she thought with amusement. In the afternoon, Grandmother Newbury packed Mrs. Kennedy and Frances off for a walk. "The old woman wants to have her regular nap," she told them. "Frances, take Mrs. Kennedy to Fern Walk and show her the famous Newbury bubble among the rocks. I want to be rid of both of you until tea time." Frances and Mrs. Kennedy went to the Fern Walk, and the beautiful bubble, a clear, round spring of amber-hued water set down in a cup of rocks overhung with ferns and beeches. It was a spot Frances had always loved. She found herself talking freely to Mrs. Kennedy of her hopes and plans. The older woman drew the girl out with tactful sympathy until she had found that Frances's dearest ambition was to someday become a writer of books like Sarah Beaumont. "Not that I expect ever to write books like hers," she said hurriedly, "and I know that it must be a long while before I can write anything worthwhile at all. But do you think, if I try hard and work hard, that I might do something in this line someday?" "I think so," said Mrs. Kennedy, smiling, "if, as you say, you are willing to work hard and study hard. There will be a great deal of both and many disappointments. Sarah Beaumont herself had a hard time at first, and for a very long first, too. Her family was poor, you know, and Sarah earned enough money to send away her first manuscripts by making a lot of jelly for a neighbor. The manuscript came back, and Sarah made more jelly and wrote more stories. Still they came back. Once she thought she'd better give up writing stories and stick to the jelly alone. There did seem to be some little demand for the one and none at all for the other. But she determined to keep on until she either succeeded or proved to her own satisfaction that she could make better jelly than stories. And, you see, she did succeed. But it means perseverance and patience and much hard work. Prepare yourself for that, Frances, and one day you will win your place. Then you will look back at the Newberry bubble and you will tell me what a good prophetess I was. They talked longer, an earnest, helpful talk that went far to inspire Frances's hazy ambition with a definite purpose. She understood that she must not write merely to win fame for herself, or even for the higher motive of pure pleasure in her work. She must aim, however humbly, to help her readers to reach higher planes of thought and endeavor. Then, and only then, would it be worthwhile. Mrs. Kennedy is going to drive you to the station, said Grandmother Newberry after tea. I am much obliged to you, Frances, for giving up the picnic today and coming to the Bayshore to gratify an old woman's inconvenient wish. But I shall not burden you with too much gratitude, for I think you have enjoyed yourself. Indeed I have, said Frances heartily. Then she added with a laugh, I think I would feel much more meritorious if it had not been so pleasant. It has robbed me of all the self-sacrificing complacency I felt this morning. You see, I wanted to go to the picnic to see Sarah Beaumont, and I felt quite like a martyr after giving it up. Grandmother Newberry's eyes twinkled. You would have been beautifully disappointed had you gone. Sarah Beaumont was not there. Mrs. Kennedy, I see you have not told our secret. Frances, my dear, let me introduce you two over again. This lady is Mrs. Sarah Beaumont Kennedy, the writer of The Story of Idlewild and all those other books you so much admire. The Newberrys were sitting on the veranda at dusk, too tired and too happy to talk. Ralph and Elliot had seen the governor. More than that, they had both been introduced to him, and he had shaken hands with both of them and told them that their father and he had been chums when just their size. And Cecilia had spent a whole day with Nan Harris, who had not changed at all except to have grown taller. But there was one little cloud on her content. I wanted to see Sarah Beaumont to tell Frances about her, but I couldn't get a glimpse of her. I don't even know if she was there. There comes Frances up the station road right now, said Ralph. My eyes, hasn't she a step? Frances came smiling over the lawn and up the steps. So you are all home safe, she said gaily. I hope you feasted your eyes on your beloved governor, boys. I can tell that Cecilia foregathered with Nan by the beatific look on her face. Oh, Fran, it was lovely, cried Cecilia, but I felt so sorry. Why didn't you let me go to Ashland? It was too bad you missed it. And Sarah Beaumont. Sarah Beaumont was at the Bayshore farm, said Frances. I'll tell you about it when I get my breath. I've been breathless ever since Grandmother Newberry told me about it. There's only one drawback to my supreme bliss, the remembrance of how complacently self-sacrificing I felt this morning. It humiliates me wholesomely to remember it. The end.